Chapter 6 of The Pathfinder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Pathfinder by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 6. These, as they change, Almighty Father, these are but the varied God. Attributed to Thompson. As the chief landed, he was met by the Pathfinder, who addressed him in the language of the warrior's people. "Was it well done, Chingachgook," said he reproachfully, "to ambush a dozen Mingos alone? Killdeer seldom fails me, it is true, but the Oswego makes a distant mark, and that miscreant showed little more than his head and shoulders above the bushes, and an unpractised hand and eye might have failed. You should have thought of this, chief, you should have thought of this." "The Great Serpent is a Mohican warrior. He sees only his enemies when he is on the war-path, and his fathers have struck the Mingos from behind since the waters began to run. I know your gifts, and respect them, too. No man shall hear me complain that a redskin observed redskin nature, but prudence as much becomes a warrior as valor, and had not the Iroquois devils been looking after their friends who were in the water, a hot trail they would have made of yourn." "What is the Delaware about to do?" exclaimed Jasper, who observed at that moment that the chief had suddenly left the Pathfinder and advanced to the water's edge, apparently with an intention of again entering the river. "He will not be so mad as to return to the other shore for any trifle he may have forgotten." "Not he, not he. He is as prudent as he is brave, in the main, though so forgetful of himself in the late ambushment. Hark ye, Jasper," leading the other a little aside, just as they heard the Indians plunge into the water. "Hark ye, lad, Chingachgook is not a Christian white man, like ourselves, but a Mohican chief, who has his gifts and traditions to tell him what he ought to do, and he who consorts with them that are not strictly and altogether of his own kind had better leave nature and use to govern his comrades. A king's soldier will swear, and he will drink, and it is of little use to try to prevent him. A gentleman likes his delicacies, and a lady her feathers, and it does not avail much to struggle against either, whereas an Indian's nature and gifts are much stronger than these, and no doubt were bestowed by the Lord for wise ends, though neither you nor me can follow them in all their windings." "What does this mean? See, the Delaware is swimming towards the body that is lodged on the rock. Why does he risk this?" "For honor and glory and renown, as great gentlemen quit their quiet homes beyond seas, where, as they tell me, heart has nothing left to wish for, that is, such hearts as can be satisfied in a clearing, to come hither to live on game and fight the Frenchers." "I understand you. Your friend has gone to secure the scalp." "'Tis his gift, and let him enjoy it. We are white men, and cannot mangle a dead enemy, but it is honor in the eyes of a redskin to do so. It may seem singular to you, Eau douce, but I've known white men of great name and character manifest as remarkable idees concerning their honor, I have." "A savage will be a savage, Pathfinder, let him keep what company he may." "It is well for us to say so, lad, but, as I tell you, white honor will not always conform to reason or to the will of God. I have passed days thinking of these matters, out in the silent woods, and have come to the opinion, boy, that, as Providence rules all things, no gift is bestowed without some wise and reasonable end." "The Serpent greatly exposes himself to the enemy in order to get his scalp. This may lose us the day." "Not in his mind, Jasper. That one scalp has more honor in it, according to the Sarpent's notions of warfare, than a field covered with slain, that kept the hair on their heads. Now, there was the fine young captain of the 60th that threw away his life in trying to bring off a 3-pounder from among the Frenchers in the last scrimmage we had. He thought he was sarving honor, and I have known a young ensign wrap himself up in his colors and go to sleep in his blood, fancying that he was lying on something softer even than buffalo skins.
Yes, yes, one can understand the merit of not hauling down an ensign.
And these are Chingachgook's colors. He will keep them to show his children's children. Here the Pathfinder interrupted himself, shook his head in melancholy, and slowly added, "Ah's me! No shoot of the old Mohican stem remains. He has no children to delight with his trophies, no tribe to honor by his deeds. He is a lone man in this world, and yet he stands true to his training and his gifts. There is something honest and respectable in these, you must allow, Jasper." Here a great outcry from the Iroquois was succeeded by the quick reports of their rifles, and so eager did the enemy become, in the desire to drive the Delaware back from his victim, that a dozen rushed into the river, several of whom even advanced near 100 feet into the foaming current, as if they actually meditated a serious sortie. But Chingachgook continued unmoved, as he remained unhurt by the missiles, accomplishing his task with the dexterity of long habit. Flourishing his reeking trophy, he gave the war whoop in its most frightful intonations, and for a minute the arches of the silent woods and the deep vista formed by the course of the river echoed with cries so terrific that Mabel bowed her head in irrepressible fear, while her uncle for a single instant actually meditated flight.
"This surpasses all I have heard from the wretches,"
Jasper exclaimed, stopping his ears, equally in horror and disgust. "'Tis their music, boy, their drum and fife, their trumpets and clarions. No doubt they love those sounds, for they stir up in them fierce feelings, and a desire for blood," returned the Pathfinder, totally unmoved. "I thought them rather frightful when a mere youngster, but they have become like the whistle of the whippoorwill, or the song of the catbird in my ear now. All the screeching reptiles that could stand between the falls and the garrison would have no effect on my nerves at this time of day. I say it not in boasting, Jasper, for the man that lets in cowardice through the ears must have but a weak heart at the best, sounds and outcries being more intended to alarm women and children than such as scout the forest and face the foe. I hope the Sarpent is now satisfied, for here he comes with a scalp at his belt." Jasper turned away his head as the Delaware rose from the river, in pure disgust at his late errand, but the Pathfinder regarded his friend with the philosophical indifference of one who had made up his mind to be indifferent to things he deemed immaterial. As the Delaware passed deeper into the bushes, with a view to wring his trifling calico dress and to prepare his rifle for service, he gave one glance of triumph at his companions, and then all emotion connected with the recent exploit seemed to cease. "Jasper," resumed the guide, "step down to the station of Master Cap and ask him to join us. We have little time for a council, and yet our plans must be laid quickly, for it will not be long before them Mingos will be plotting our ruin." The young man complied, and in a few minutes the four were assembled near the shore, completely concealed from the view of their enemies, while they kept a vigilant watch over the proceedings of the latter, in order to consult on their own future movements. By this time the day had so far advanced as to leave but a few minutes between the passing light and an obscurity that promised to be even deeper than common. The sun had already set, and the twilight of a low latitude would soon pass into the darkness of deep night. Most of the hopes of the party rested on this favorable circumstance, though it was not without its dangers also, as the very obscurity which would favor their escape would be as likely to conceal the movements of their wily enemies. "The moment is come, men," Pathfinder commenced, "when our plans must be coolly laid, in order that we may act together, and with a right understanding of our errand and gifts. In an hour's time these woods will be as dark as midnight, and if we are ever to gain the garrison, it must be done under favor of this advantage. What say you, Master Cap? For, though none of the most experienced in combats and retreats in the woods, your years entitle you to speak first in a matter like this, and in a council." "Well, in my judgment, all we have to do is to go on board the canoe when it gets to be so dark the enemy's lookouts can't see us, and run for the haven, as wind and tide will allow." "That is easily said, but not so easily done," returned the guide. "We shall be more exposed in the river than by following the woods, and then there is the Oswego rift below us, and I am far from certain that Jasper himself can carry a boat safely through it in the dark. What say you, lad, as to your own skill and judgment?"
"I am of Master Cap's opinion about using the canoe. Mabel is too tender to walk through swamps and among roots of trees in such a night as this promises to be, and then I always feel myself stouter of heart and truer of eye when afloat than when ashore."
"Stout of heart you always be, lad, and I think tolerably true of eye for one who has lived so much in broad sunshine and so little in the woods. Ah's me, the Ontario has no trees, or it would be a plain to delight a hunter's heart. As to your opinion, friends, there is much for and much against it. For it, it may be said water leaves no trail." "What do you call the wake?" interrupted the pertinacious and dogmatical Cap. "Anan?"
"Go on," said Jasper. "Master Cap thinks he's on the ocean. Water leaves no trail."
"It leaves none, O deuce hereaway, though I do not pretend to say what it may leave on the sea. Then a canoe is both swift and easy when it floats with the current, and the tender limbs of the sergeant's daughter will be favored by its motion. But, on the other hand, the river will have no cover but the clouds in the heavens. The rift is a ticklish thing for boats to venture into, even by daylight, and it is 6 fairly measured miles by water from this spot to the garrison. Then a trail on land is not easy to be found in the dark. I am troubled, Jasper, to say which way we ought to counsel and advise."
"If the Serpent and myself could swim into the river and bring off the other canoe," the young sailor replied, "it would seem to me that our safest course would be the water."
"If, indeed! And yet it might easily be done, as soon as it is a little darker. Well, I am not sartain it will be the best; though, were we only a party of men, it would be like a hunt to the lusty and brave to play at hide and seek with yonder miscreants on the other shore, Jasper," continued the guide, into whose character there entered no ingredient which belonged to vain display or theatrical effect. "Will you undertake to bring in the canoe?"
"I will undertake anything that will serve and protect Mabel, Pathfinder."
"That is an upright feeling, and I suppose it is nature. The Sarpent, who is nearly naked already, can help you, and this will be cutting off one of the means of them devils to work their harm."
This material point being settled, the different members of the party prepared themselves to put the project in execution.
The shades of evening fell fast upon the forest, and by the time all was ready for the attempt, it was found impossible to discern objects on the opposite shore. Time now pressed, for Indian cunning could devise so many expedients for passing so narrow a stream, that the Pathfinder was getting impatient to quit the spot. While Jasper and his companion entered the river, armed with nothing but their knives and the Delaware's tomahawk, observing the greatest caution not to betray their movements, the guide brought Mabel from her place of concealment, and, bidding her and Cap proceed along the shore to the foot of the rapids, he got into the canoe that remained in his possession, in order to carry it to the same place. This was easily effected. The canoe was laid against the bank, and Mabel and her uncle entered it, taking their seats as usual, while the Pathfinder, erect in the stern, held by a bush, in order to prevent the swift stream from sweeping them down its current. Several minutes of intense and breathless expectation followed, while they awaited the results of the bold attempt of their comrades. It will be understood that the 2 adventurers were compelled to swim across a deep and rapid channel before they could reach a part of the rift that admitted of wading. This portion of the enterprise was soon effected, and Jasper and the Serpent struck the bottom side by side at the same instant. Having secured firm footing, they took hold of each other's hands, and waded slowly and with extreme caution in the supposed direction of the canoe. but the darkness was already so deep that they soon ascertained they were to be but little aided by the sense of sight, and that their search must be conducted on that species of instinct which enables the woodsman to find his way when the sun is hid, no stars appear, and all would seem chaos to one less accustomed to the mazes of the forest. Under these circumstances, Jasper submitted to be guided by the Delaware, whose habits best fitted him to take the lead. Still, it was no easy matter to wade amid the roaring element at that hour, and retain a clear recollection of the localities. By the time they believed themselves to be in the center of the stream, the two shores were discernible merely by masses of obscurity denser than common, the outlines against the clouds being barely distinguishable by the ragged tops of the trees. Once or twice the wanderers altered their course, in the consequence of unexpectedly stepping into deep water, for they knew that the boat had lodged on the shallowest part of the rift. In short, with this fact for their compass, Jasper and his companion wandered about in the water for nearly a quarter of an hour, and at the end of that period, which began to appear interminable to the young man, they found themselves apparently no nearer the object of their search than they had been at its commencement. Just as the Delaware was about to stop, in order to inform his associate that they would do well to return to the land, in order to take a fresh departure, he saw the form of a man moving about in the water, almost within reach of his arm. Jasper was at his side, and he at once understood that the Iroquois were engaged on the same errand as he was himself.
"Mingo," he uttered in Jasper's ear, "the serpent will show his brother how to be cunning."
The young sailor caught a glimpse of the figure at that instant, and the startling truth also flashed on his mind. Understanding the necessity of trusting all to the Delaware chief, he kept back, while his friend moved cautiously in the direction in which the strange form had vanished. In another moment it was seen again, evidently moving towards themselves. The waters made such an uproar that little was to be apprehended from ordinary sounds, and the Indian, turning his head, hastily said, "Leave it to the cunning of the great serpent."
"Phew!"
exclaimed the strange savage, adding in the language of his people,
"The canoe is found, but there were none to help me. Come, let us raise it from the rock."
"Willingly," answered Chingachgook, who understood the dialect. "Lead, we will follow." The stranger, unable to distinguish between voices and accents amid the raging of the rapid, led the way in the necessary direction, and, the two others keeping close at his heels, all three speedily reached the canoe. The Iroquois laid hold of one end, Chingachgook placed himself in the center, and Jasper went to the opposite extremity, as it was important that the stranger should not detect the presence of a pale face, a discovery that might be made by the parts of the dress the young man still wore, as well as by the general appearance of his head.
"Lift,"
said the Iroquois in the sententious manner of his race, and by a trifling effort the canoe was raised from the rock, held a moment in the air to empty it, and then placed carefully on the water in its proper position. All three held it firmly, lest it should escape from their hands under the pressure of the violent current, while the Iroquois, who led, of course, being at the upper end of the boat, took the direction of the eastern shore, or towards the spot where his friends waited his return. As the Delaware and Jasper well knew there must be several more of the Iroquois on the rift, from the circumstance that their own appearance had occasioned no surprise in the individual they had met, both felt the necessity of extreme caution. Men less bold and determined would have thought they were incurring too great a risk by thus venturing into the midst of their enemies, but these hardy borderers were unacquainted with fear, were accustomed to hazards, and so well understood the necessity of at least preventing their foes from getting the boat, that they would have cheerfully encountered even greater risks to secure their object. So all important to the safety of Mabel, indeed, did Jasper deem the possession or the destruction of this canoe, that he had drawn his knife and stood ready to rip up the bark, in order to render the boat temporarily unserviceable, should anything occur to compel the Delaware and himself to abandon their prize. In the meantime, the Iroquois, who led the way, proceeded slowly through the water in the direction of his own party, still grasping the canoe, and dragging his reluctant followers in his train. Once Chingachgook raised his tomahawk, and was about to bury it in the brain of his confiding and unsuspicious neighbor, but the probability that the death cry or the floating body might give the alarm induced that wary chief to change his purpose. At the next moment he regretted this indecision, for the three who clung to the canoe suddenly found themselves in the center of a party of no less than 4 others who were in quest of it. After the usual brief characteristic exclamations of satisfaction, the savages eagerly laid hold of the canoe, for all seemed impressed with the necessity of securing this important boat, the one side in order to assail their foes, and the other to secure their retreat. The addition to the party, however, was so unlooked for, and so completely gave the enemy the superiority, that for a few moments the ingenuity and address of even the Delaware were at fault. The 5 Iroquois, who seemed perfectly to understand their errand, pressed forward towards their own shore, without pausing to converse, their object being in truth to obtain the paddles, which they had previously secured, and to embark 3 or 4 warriors, with all their rifles and powder horns, the want of which had alone prevented their crossing the river by swimming as soon as it was dark. In this manner the body of friends and foes, united, reached the margin of the eastern channel, where, as in the case of the western, the river was too deep to be waded. Here a short pause succeeded, it being necessary to determine the manner in which the canoe was to be carried across. One of the 4 who had just reached the boat was a chief, and the habitual deference which the American Indian pays to merit, experience, and station, kept the others silent until this individual had spoken. The halt greatly added to the danger of discovering the presence of Jasper, in particular, who, however, had the precaution to throw the cap he wore in the bottom of the canoe. Being without his jacket and shirt, the outline of his figure, in the obscurity, would now be less likely to attract observation. His position, too, at the stern of the canoe a little favored his concealment, the Iroquois naturally keeping their looks directed the other way. Not so with Chingachgook. This warrior was literally in the midst of his most deadly foes, and he could scarcely move without touching one of them. Yet he was apparently unmoved, though he kept all his senses on the alert, in readiness to escape, or to strike a blow at the proper moment. By carefully abstaining from looking towards those behind him, he lessened the chances of discovery, and waited with the indomitable patience of an Indian for the instant when he should be required to act. "Let all my young men but 2, one at each end of the canoe, cross and get their arms," said the Iroquois chief. "Let the 2 push over the boat." The Indians quietly obeyed, leaving Jasper at the stern, and the Iroquois who had found the canoe at the bow of the light craft, Chingachgook burying himself so deep in the river as to be passed by the others without detection. The splashing in the water, the tossing arms, and the calls of one to another, soon announced that the 4 who had last joined the party were already swimming. As soon as this fact was certain, the Delaware rose, resumed his former station, and began to think the moment for action was come. One less habitually under self-restraint than this warrior would probably have now aimed his meditated blow, but Chingachgook knew there were more Iroquois behind him on the rift, and he was a warrior much too trained and experienced to risk anything unnecessarily. He suffered the Indian at the bow of the canoe to push off into the deep water, and then all 3 were swimming in the direction of the eastern shore. Instead, however, of helping the canoe across the swift current, no sooner did the Delaware and Jasper find themselves within the influence of its greatest force than both began to swim in a way to check their farther progress across the stream. Nor was this done suddenly, or in the incautious manner in which a civilized man would have been apt to attempt the artifice, but warily, and so gradually that the Iroquois at the bow fancied at first he was merely struggling against the strength of the current. Of course, while acted on by these opposing efforts, the canoe drifted downstream, and in about a minute it was floating in still deeper water at the foot of the rift. Here, however, the Iroquois was not slow in finding that something unusual retarded their advance, and looking back, he first learned that he was resisted by the efforts of his companions. That second nature which grows up through habit instantly told the young Iroquois that he was alone with enemies. Dashing the water aside, he sprang at the throat of Chingachgook, and the two Indians, relinquishing their hold of the canoe, seized each other like tigers. In the midst of the darkness of that gloomy night, and floating in an element so dangerous to man when engaged in deadly strife, they appeared to forget everything but their fell animosity and their mutual desire to conquer. Jasper had now complete command of the canoe, which flew off like a feather impelled by the breath, under the violent reaction of the struggles of the two combatants. The first impulse of the youth was to swim to the aid of the Delaware, but the importance of securing the boat presented itself with tenfold force, while he listened to the heavy breathings of the warriors as they throttled each other, and he proceeded as fast as possible towards the western shore. This he soon reached, and after a short search he succeeded in discovering the remainder of the party and in procuring his clothes. A few words sufficed to explain the situation in which he had left the Delaware and the manner in which the canoe had been obtained. When those who had been left behind had heard the explanations of Jasper, a profound stillness reigned among them, each listening intently in the vain hope of catching some clue to the result of the fearful struggle that had just taken place, if it were not still going on in the water. Nothing was audible beyond the steady roar of the rushing river, it being a part of the policy of their enemies on the opposite shore to observe the most death-like stillness. "Take this paddle, Jasper," said Pathfinder calmly, though the listeners thought his voice sounded more melancholy than usual, "and follow with your own canoe. It is unsafe for us to remain here longer." "But the Serpent?" "The Great Sarpent is in the hands of his own deity, and will live or die according to the intentions of Providence. We can do him no good, and may risk too much by remaining here in idleness, like women talking over their distresses. This darkness is very precious." A loud, long, piercing yell came from the shore, and cut short the words of the guide. "What is the meaning of that uproar, Master Pathfinder?" demanded Cap. "It sounds more like the outcries of devils than anything that can come from the throats of Christians and men." "Christians they are not, and do not pretend to be, and do not wish to be, and in calling them devils you have scarcely misnamed them. That yell is one of rejoicing, and it is as conquerors they have given it. The body of the Sarpent, no doubt, dead or alive, is in their power." "And we," exclaimed Jasper, who felt a pang of generous regret, as the idea that he might have averted the calamity presented itself to his mind, had he not deserted his comrade. "We can do the chief no good, lad, and must quit this spot as fast as possible." "Without one attempt to rescue him, without even knowing whether he be dead or living?" "Jasper is right," said Mabel, who could speak, though her voice sounded huskily and smothered. "I have no fears, uncle, and will stay here until we know what has become of our friend." "That seems reasonable, Pathfinder," put in Cap. "Your true seaman cannot well desert a messmate, and I am glad to find that motives so correct exist among those freshwater people." "Tut, tut!" returned the impatient guide, forcing the canoe into the stream as he spoke. "You know nothing, and you fear nothing. If you value your lives, think of reaching the garrison, and leave the Delaware in the hands of Providence. Ah's me, the deer that goes too often to the lick meets the hunter at last." End of chapter.